Thanks, Chair. I'm going to pick up exactly where Deputy Doherty left off. I'd love to share your optimism, but I don't trust the European Commission for 1 second, based on everything that they have been party to happening in this country. Nor do I trust the government, because clearly Minister Noonan has no problem allowing sales to happen without any protections of the type that you're talking about. So, Mr. Deacon, for what you're suggesting to be true, the European Commission would have to be insisting on a higher level of guarantee than our own Minister for Finance and Government is happy with. Now, it's not your area, this is an area of policy decisions, but I have to say, I don't share your comfort in any way. I think Minister Noonan will happily allow these assets be sold to the highest bidder and to hell with the mortgage holders, just like he's doing in letting the special liquidator for IBRC doing what they're doing. I think the government's position on this is very clear. The question Deputy Doherty asked, though, which wasn't answered, was, can we legally ring-fence these assets as they transfer into Bank of Ireland so that under Irish law, because I certainly am not going to be relying on the European Commission to protect anyone in Ireland, under Irish law, could it stop Bank of Ireland from selling them on to an unregulated entity?
Well, the primary difficulty with that approach, Deputy, would really be that if we were, for example, to introduce a provision of that nature, anybody who was looking to purchase any assets from Bank of Ireland thereafter would have to satisfy themselves and identify that those weren't assets, those weren't part of this bundle of mortgages, for example, that transferred in from ICS, and that would inevitably lead to enormous complications going down the line. So if you try and differentiate a particular class of assets like that is going to be transferred into a larger pool, you're inevitably going to give rise to legal complications. That's aside entirely from the fact that if that were to be done, that would inevitably, I suggest, to Bank of Ireland give rise to issues as to whether they would be well advised to seek to transfer from ICS into Bank of Ireland, to invoke that sort of restriction, because of the complications it would, the contamination effect that it would be likely to have on the rest of their pool of assets. Obviously, the issue of whether it would be legally possible is really primarily a matter for the Attorney General to consider, and not for us necessarily, but it is clear that it would certainly give rise to complexities if we were to attempt to do it. And it's worth bearing in mind that's what is being proposed here is to effectively transfer from one regulated financial service provider to another. That's what the legislation is giving effect to. It is clear.
It's not. I mean, Deputy Doherty has covered this. That may be what's going to be in the bill, but it is clear that Bank of Ireland will have a requirement to sell on a lot of these assets. So it is not true to say that all we're looking at here is a transfer from ICS to Bank of Ireland. We are not. We are clearly looking at a transfer from ICS to Bank of Ireland to a third party. Now, I can't think of any regulated entity that's going to be interested in buying loan books in Ireland. None of them are buying any of the other loan books. The people who are coming in to buy them are the distressed asset specialists. It's the folk from Dallas and it's the folk from all of those other places. We know they're getting ready to start bidding on Bank of Ireland and Permanent TSB and all sorts of other distressed assets. We know that's going to happen. So who's going to buy them? They're going to be bid for by the same people who are bidding for the IBRC loan book, right? And that is unregulated entity. So it is not accurate. Whilst it might be technically true on this bill, it is not accurate to say that all we're talking about is a transfer from ICS to Bank of Ireland.
No, and clearly we opened by outlining that it's anticipated that there'll be a further transfer on. But it's worth bearing in mind, Deputy, that the core of what is being transferred is the ICS platform. And that is something that is of interest not to a hedge fund who's looking to sort of exact value out of existing assets, but from somebody who's going to be generating business themselves. And such a purchaser will almost inevitably be seeking authorization. And it's, as matters stand, we have no indication whatsoever that there is any likelihood that these assets, first of all, it's not necessarily the case that mortgages would be transferred on. That's something that will be there at the option of the purchaser. Whether mortgages and matching deposits are included as part of the transaction. But But even if they are, the reality is that it's unlikely that any purchaser would not be a regulated financial service provider, because they will want to maximize the value of the ICS platform.
And I think it's worth saying, you know, the objective here is potentially the promotion of competition. Now, you buy a platform, so you buy intellectual property, you buy, you know, other assets that enable you to carry out a business which I'm sure any potential acquirer would intend to grow. So, you know, there is optionality around whether any particular acquirer acquires mortgages and matching deposits or not. So it is not, I suppose, a foregone conclusion that any particular acquirer would acquire any mortgages or any deposits here. I mean, this is a measure that is intended to promote competition, and competition necessarily, I'm sure from an acquirer's perspective, intonates the growing of one's business, not necessarily, it would not necessarily attract the type of entities that you've referred to.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. It is not a foregone conclusion, though it would be a very peculiar thing for any commercial entity to purchase a platform and not have a mortgage book behind that platform already working away, right? And that would be a bizarre situation. So whilst I accept that it's not a foregone conclusion, it's highly likely. You're not going to buy a platform and not bring a mortgage book in with it. Well, right? You're not going to have a whole back end of a retail banking operation sitting there waiting for the first few mortgages to gain approval. You're going to have a mortgage book which your staff are working on in the back end, and you're going to add and subtract to it all the time, right? I mean, there's no way anyone is going to buy a banking platform and not attach an existing loan book to it. Wouldn't you think?
I mean, look, it's not really for me to say.
Right.
But ultimately, you know, I think from a purchaser's perspective, they will look at a mechanism for which to grow this business.
Sure. Okay. Can I ask, does this effectively shut ICS? Or the conversation we've just had, Mr. Eaton, suggests that ICS as a brand, ICS as a retail network, ICS as whatever, all its IP, whatever that IP may be, will continue to exist. So from the public's perspective, they won't see anything. This is an ownership issue, that essentially ICS will continue to operate, the staff will continue to be employed. There will undoubtedly be a loan book plugged into the front end, the retail end. Is not that the idea? The idea is not that ICS disappears, and that this is essentially an asset transfer.
That's correct. Yeah. And effectively the brand is transferring. Now, it's probably worth pointing out that the building society itself will, you know, the business is probably continuing, but as a building society, no.
Thanks. I have to say it is ironic for me to be concerned about loans leaving Bank of Ireland. So certainly, whether or not you're a mortgage holder and you want your mortgage owned by an unregulated entity or Bank of Ireland, will be an unenviable position for these mortgage holders to be in. On that, can I ask, are you aware of any difference in approach to mortgage resolution solutions being applied to ICS customers as opposed to what Bank of Ireland is doing, or is it on the basis that Bank of Ireland owns ICS? Is it essentially the same suite of solutions, so-called solutions, that are being used?
I'm not aware of any distinction, but I can't be absolute. I can't tell you that I'm certain that it's an identical approach that's taken in both.
Has the department looked into that?
The department obviously is engaged in looking at addressing mortgage arrears across the whole system, but whether somebody has looked to clarify whether ICS customers are being treated in any way dissimilarly from other Bank of Ireland sort of main company customers, I doubt if they are, but I'm not aware whether anyone has made that very specific inquiry.
Thank you.
The department would clearly be satisfied that the customers across the system are all being dealt with within a particular framework, which is the code of conduct on mortgage arrears. So,
well, most of them, not all of them, obviously. Some of them have no protection in the CCMA.
Yes, but those in ICS or in Bank of Ireland would both be within the rubric of CCMA, but whether sort of a more granular approach for particular books is taken within that spectrum, I'm not aware.
Yeah, okay. The reason I ask is because it's possible that ICS are getting a different suite of mortgage solutions. And one of the things that I fail to see coming out of this government, and indeed from the department, and it goes to the heart of what's happening in IBRC, is anyone asking the question, what are the implications of this law or this policy for mortgage holders, right? Clearly no one in the department has asked that question in terms of IBRC. We know Mr. Noonan is on the record as saying that no department official has even seen the Special Liquidators report, which refuses to allow the customers, the citizens and borrowers to bid for their own mortgages. So I guess another version of the question is anyone in the department, based on this transfer, asking the question, does this adversely affect the mortgage holders?
Yes. No, that is something that is being carefully considered in the context of this transaction.
And does it?
And as you're aware, Deputy, from our previous appearance here a number of weeks ago, the department is actively exploring legislation to protect, exploring the possibility of legislating to protect mortgage holders who are transferred to unregulated financial service providers across the system, not just in the context of this. As I've said, though, in this particular instance, it's not currently anticipated that it's likely that a purchaser who is not a regulated financial service provider will be acquiring this platform.
Is it the opinion of the department? So you're saying someone within the department has asked the question, does this adversely affect the ICS borrowers? Correct?
Yes.
What's the department's answer to that question?
I suppose that we're satisfied. I mean, it's something that's being considered in the context of the legislation, whether or not borrowers will be adversely affected. Are indeed depositors. So that's one of the factors that had to be considered in terms of the transfer. Now, I know we're talking about a two-step process here. So I suppose in terms of the legislation, the initial transfer is to Bank of Ireland. So it wouldn't appear that there's any real adverse consequence for members from that aspect of it.
Just on that piece.
Yes.
If the department doesn't know whether there's any difference in approach to mortgage resolutions being used with ICS customers versus Bank of Ireland customers, how can you conclude that the ICS customers will not be adversely affected by being subsumed into Bank of Ireland?
So the department is aware that the customers in ICS and in Bank of Ireland are both being treated under the framework of the CCMA, and we're clear that that is the case, so that all of them are receiving the same level of protection that's extended across the system as a whole. I would anticipate that if there were some particular difficulty, in terms of contrast from the ICS mortgage holders or the Bank of Ireland mortgage holders, that's something we will be aware of. I personally amn't aware whether that particular inquiry has been made. That's not to say that I am certain that nobody has looked at whether there is any difference in approach between ICS and Bank of Ireland. It's just that I'm not in a position to say to you here, Deputy, that somebody has looked at that specifically. I would be very surprised if there were any significant contrast in the approach being taken by Bank of Ireland effectively towards those mortgage holders who are in ICS and those mortgage holders who are in Bank of Ireland. I don't see any reason why they would be likely to differentiate between them.
Checked.
I haven't checked.
And no one in the department has checked.
I'm not aware whether anyone else in the department has checked, and it wouldn't be my role to be checking that relationship in terms of ICS and Bank of Ireland.
Whose role would it be?
Well, there are elements of the department that supervise each of the various institutions.
Okay, well, you will be shortly, and I'll bring you back in again. Okay?
Thanks, Chair. I'll leave the point. The point, I hope, is reasonably well made. I don't believe the department is asking the question, does this adversely affect the ICS customers in a meaningful way? Because if no one in the department has checked whether or not they are currently being treated in a different way, if your answer is, well, sure, look, they're all under the CCMA, sure, AIB and Bank of Ireland customers are both under the CCMA. They're being treated in completely different ways by the two banks. So if you want to credibly come before this committee and say, we in the Department of Finance are satisfied that the bill we are putting before you will not adversely affect ICS borrowers, you must know whether or not they are currently being treated in a different way to Bank of Ireland borrowers, right? That is not an unreasonable thing to ask. So could I ask that someone in the department maybe goes and takes a look at that?
Yes.
Thank you very much.